Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone here today on behalf of the Gordon Institute of Business Science and the GIBS Media Leadership Think Tank. A very, very warm welcome to a non-snowing Joburg. It's a really, really great honor for me to be able to welcome such a really distinguished group of people here today from all over the world. Some of you have literally spent days getting here. Some have rearranged existing travel plans, and you've all managed to fit this conference into your incredibly busy schedules, and we really, really appreciate that. I'll also welcome all the people joining us on Zoom from all over the world. It's great to have you here. Today, we've managed to bring together journalists, publishers, media organizations, academics, activists, some lawyers, some economists, all with the common goal of finding solutions to the crisis facing the long-term sustainability of journalism and how this crisis intersects with the conduct of big tech platforms. So we're here with people from 24 countries, and I really hope that we can bring our collective wisdom together to try and help find these solutions. I just want to go very quickly to saying thank you to our sponsors, because I think without them, we wouldn't be here today. To the Military Foundation, to the Open Society Foundations, Reset, Fund for Public Interest Media. Really thank you for your generous support in helping make this event happen, and mostly strongly believing in the importance and timing of this global discussion. It's deeply appreciated. I just want to basically emphasize that I think it's self-evident from the attendance here this morning that this crisis is a global one, spanning continents and hemispheres, impacting a range of media organizations from public to private to community to legacy print organizations to digital-only publications. And today we meet in Johannesburg to discuss the crisis in recognition that the challenge of sustaining journalism, in particular public interest journalism, is far more acute in the global south. I want to just emphasize that journalism is not just a practice or an isolated profession. Research by several participants here today say that there's a symbiotic relationship between the sustainability of journalism. In fact, there's like a codependency, never mind just a symbiotic relationship, between the sustainability of journalism as a public good and the democratic health of a country. A crisis for the long-term sustainability of journalism and independent public interest journalism is therefore an impending crisis for democracy. Our focus on the intersection between policy on platforms and policy on sustaining journalism is not just to say this is the only issue facing media viability in the global south. I think we all know that there are many other problems and many other solutions being proposed, like the first thing I would say is pervasive digital authoritarianism and repressive laws curbing media and internet freedom around the world. That has to be the number one problem staring us all in the face in terms of the actual environment. But on financial sustainability, one is not only looking to big tech. There are other solutions. Many people have written about it, about better coordination between donors, new forms of training, non-discriminatory government advertising, and more innovative business models. But over the next few days, what we want to do is, clicking here, is basically discuss and drill down on how to look at this economic relationship between big tech and journalism, because to be independent, to be an essential service and a public good, journalism first has to survive. Now, if my clicker will work, guys, if it doesn't, just change the slides for me. Thank you. Let's just keep going. I just want to emphasize that this was set out very lucidly by UNESCO last year. And I quote, "For journalism to fulfill its mission as a public good and essential service, media must must be not only independent, but it must be economically viable. If the viability of media is under constant threat, journalism as a distinctive communication in the public interest cannot be sustainable. Media viability gives journalism the institutional strength and autonomy to perform its role as a public good. Now, basically, we're looking at a new policy area. I think we all understand it. This is almost a new genre of regulation, with examples in the single digits and a history of less than a decade. Drawing on strong policy experience and best practice was also important when we were actually developing our post-apartheid broadcasting framework almost 30 years to the day. I was a young media activist at the time, and I was working on a constitutional negotiation committee where we were trying to develop a law to regulate broadcasting in a post-apartheid South Africa. And our civil society organization were very, very insistent that we also protected our own content, our indigenous content. So we scoured the world for examples of which countries were doing it in 1993. And it was very clear. And I think it's no coincidence that the two countries that really stood tall in this space were Australia and Canada. And we ended up borrowing quite liberally from the Canadians and the Australians. So any mistakes, we can blame on them. But actually, seriously, it was a real help to see that two countries, and I think France followed a bit later, were really determined to take a lead in an area that the rest of the world didn't seem that interested in doing. And so we passed these mandatory quotas, and I remember an executive from the broadcasting industry said to me, "These quotas will destroy the broadcasting industry as we know it." Well, how wrong they were. But I thought it was quite interesting, and listening to some of our Brazilian colleagues, that this was a similar kind of misinformation that was amplified by Google in Brazil when they said that the fake news bill will destroy the Brazilian internet as the Brazilians know it. And of course, this is simply not true. But one thing is interesting, the media environment may have changed drastically in the last 30 years, but the efforts to maintain the status quo haven't really changed that much. But on a more positive note, I just want to quote Professor Taylor Owen from McGill University, who really nailed it on a recent podcast. And he was talking about the Canadian C-18 bill. I'd like to quote him. He said, "Being late to the game means we can learn from mistakes and successes from other jurisdictions. It is a unique policy domain that has never been tried before. Everyone sees similar problems, but everyone is going to have slightly different solutions based on their own democratic systems, their own jurisdictions, and their own economies." He said, "This actually creates the perfect Petri dish for policy experimentation." So welcome to the Petri dish. Now, we need to acknowledge that there are, of course, strident critiques of bargaining codes from a spectrum of ideological perspectives, although these seem to be wedded to either finding a perfect solution that doesn't exist or not even looking for a solution at all. We know that none of the existing or proposed bargaining codes are without fault, and we know that they can be improved. Hopefully, this conference will identify the necessary improvements and remedies, and we can discuss them further. One remedy that we don't have in the Global South is the breakup of big tech. And I think, to be fair, the only places that really do have that remedy is Washington and Brussels. So we have to focus on solutions here in the Global South and probably elsewhere, is on those that are within our jurisdictional scope and those that we can actually implement in our own countries. And I really hope we can explore many of these remedies at this conference. Then we go on to, I'd like to just mention the fact that one of the aims of this conference, the first aim is to share information. And you'll see the way the program has been structured. There's these keynotes, these regional panels. So the first day and a half, we'll be sharing a lot of information from our different countries and hopefully learning from each other. But the next one is to try and develop a collective and principled view on draft global principles for big tech and journalism as a guide to any legislative or regulatory interventions across countries and continents. We would also like these principles to align with existing global and developmental processes. And tomorrow you'll get a chance to discuss them in more detail, and hopefully the discussions over the next day or so can inform the breakaway groups. But I just want to highlight two of those principles. I'm not going to go through all of these. You've obviously had a look at them, but the two that really I think are important to highlight are independence and transparency. On the independent side, it is vitally important that any mechanism, whether it's bargaining codes, tax incentives, copyright laws, does not compromise the independence of the news publisher and journalists being funded. It's actually core to the definition of journalism as a public good that it remains independent journalism and an essential service in the public interest. But another more related issue is there are concerns which have been raised in South Africa and elsewhere that what about journalist entities that are not independent in the first place? What about those who don't subject themselves to self-regulatory press codes and who are also known purveyors of misinformation? Would they still qualify to benefit from these codes as currently conceived? I know that SANEF, the South African National Editors Forum, and civil society has raised this very issue with the Competition Commission, that they need to look at how to differentiate, if possible, with people who are not subscribing to self-regulatory codes, and I hope we can discuss this further. And then I'd like to look at the principle of transparency, because I think that's becoming an incredibly important area. There's really three elements to it. For me, the first level, obviously there's global calls for the platforms to qualitatively improve data sharing with international bodies, academics, researchers, public interest groups, and others researching areas including content moderation, disinformation, online harms, human rights, and safety of journalists. There has been some movement, I believe, and there's been some multi-stakeholder engagement, but those closer to the situation say it's not yet enough. Secondly, and more relevant to this conference, there's the demand for the transparency of deals between news publishers that they make with platforms. There's a strong debate about this. I don't think it's required in Australia. Others are demanding that there should be transparency, and I think it's a debating point, something to discuss and something to note for further reference. Thirdly, and I think almost not most importantly, but very importantly, there's been increasingly urgent demands for platforms to share data to ensure the long-term sustainability of media and journalism in the public interest. I mean, this is not to say that platforms are not sharing any data at all. They are, but it's common cause that the platforms do not share all the relevant and requested data on news content with those who produce the content and who own the content. So publishers are not getting the required data that they need. And I think that the key to some of the problems that we are facing in this area is to get meaningful and mandated access by news publishers to more granular data about their news content, including prior notice of relevant algorithmic changes, more data on retention and engagement rates, how content is ranked, algorithmically amplified, monetized, ad tech shares. People want to find out how their content is being seen and engaged with and used on these platforms. Undersharing of data also lessens publishers' ability to shape their offering in a more meaningful way. But it's also very true, publishers have to know what they want. And I think that's another discussion point at this conference. It's okay to say we want more data, but do we know what data we want? And that's something I think we need to hone on and discuss. In my view, specified, defined data sharing should be included as a contractual requirement in agreements with the platforms. And I also think that sharing the data would be a good confidence-building mechanism in resetting the relationship and enabling good faith negotiations between the news publishers and the platforms. And I know they're listening today, they've signed in, and I really make that appeal, is that this would really, really be a good faith measure to say, you know what, to improve the situation, let's find out what publishers really want, and let's start sharing the right data. Another important topic, and I think it's not an easy one to solve, is calculating the value and the revenue gap between what publishers feel they owed and what platforms deny they are owed. And I think this conference will also discuss methodologies on how to address the value and revenue gap between news publishers and platforms. Tomorrow we'll hear more about interesting research conducted on behalf of Swiss publishers on how to value the revenue shortfall, and I really look forward to that. Google, we know, has concluded many private agreements with publishers around the world and is currently in negotiations with larger publishers, including proposals to set up specific country funds in South Africa as well. Given the financial crisis facing journalism, understandably, many publishers can't sit around and wait for regulatory processes, which can take years. And so one can understand how they are doing these deals before the regulation. And I think we look forward to that discussion because it's not just happening in one country, it's happening across the world. But I think one thing that's interesting, and I refer to research released last week by Charis Papaevangelou, a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam in collaboration with McGill University Center for Media Technology and Democracy. He analyzed Google and Meta's philanthropic grants across the world. His findings indicated a possible correlation between these grants and countries with the greatest likelihood of bargaining style regulation. He found that the US had more beneficiaries than any other country, with Brazil and Canada, interestingly, as second and third place. Now, for me, whatever the motivation, and some of them I'm sure might be very good faith, for me, these philanthropic grants should just be filed under the right thing to do, because what we are looking at are two global companies that control most of the world's digital ad revenues and have historically extracted huge value from news content. So let's not praise a fish for swimming. This is something one expects that they should do as normal corporate social responsibility, but we also know it is trotted out as evidence when people give testimony in parliaments and regulators to say, look what we're doing for the news industry, and absolutely they are, but it's something one expects from companies with such a dominant role in an industry, okay? Now, when it comes to big tech's attitude to regulation, I really loved the expression from Zeynep Tufekci, who she dubbed it perfectly as regulation by public apology. Now, when we look at this, big tech CEOs are often appearing before legislatures in the US, in the UK, and in Canada and Europe, and apologizing for the various consequential and harmful outcomes flowing from their platforms. But to paraphrase, what they're really saying is, we're really sorry, we promise to do better, and we welcome regulation. We welcome regulation. But the unspoken caveat is, we welcome regulation if it does not impact the way we operate in any material way. And I think that's important. We're already seeing echoes of regulation by public apology when it comes to CEOs of generative AI companies giving evidence in the US Congress and elsewhere. And, it's quite interesting staying with AI for a minute. It's to see that, and connecting with this conference, it was reported last month that some of the world's biggest brands, digital brands in the Digital Content Next Trade Association, are determined not to be late in the game again, and have warned that generative AI content could violate copyright law. It is clear that the large digital publishers want to get ahead of the curve this time to protect their considerable archives of copyrighted material from being used to train LLMs and then used to generate revenue for AI companies without compensation or referencing to publishers. In South Africa, civil society groups have welcomed the Competition Commission's decision to, quote, include the use of generative artificial intelligence and other new technologies in the scope of the recent media and digital platforms market inquiry that's getting going. I believe this is a very positive approach by the Commission. So just, to end off, I'd really like to say a couple of words lastly about Google and Facebook's attitude and reaction to the Canadian bill. It appears that when democratic governments, legislatures, and regulators cannot be stopped by traditional lobbying means, the Google and Facebook playbook is to threaten to cut off news distribution on their platforms, as they have threatened in Canada and as Facebook tried and relented in Australia. Now, I basically think that, some people say to me, they're commercially driven businesses. They've got the right side who their partners are. But this ignores the obvious fact that these companies are not ordinary businesses. They are some of the biggest companies in human history. Many believe that their threatened exclusionary conduct could amount to an abuse of power across search, social media, and ad tech, with the effect of also undermining democracies. It is not a good look, that's for sure. But make no mistake, the threat to block and remove Canadian news publishers is also meant as a thinly veiled warning to Brazil, to South Africa, to the UK, to Indonesia, that they know are weighing these options up. And what they're warning is, don't try this at home. But what I want to just end off with is, we have to try this at home. We believe that we have no choice but to consider exploring workable solutions in our own countries. The future of journalism, public interest media, and democracy is at stake. What could be more important? I thank you and wish you a great conference and good discussions ahead. Thanks very much.